Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to our Privacy Made Positive webinar. I'm going to wait a minute or so to let a few more people join. While I'm doing that, why don't you familiarise yourselves with the question panel so that you can put your questions in as we go along. There is a Q&A at the end, and all of us will be here to answer your questions and talk some more about why privacy is a positive value. So we'll just give it a minute and then we will move into the presentation itself. Right, I think we should begin. So let me start by introducing our panel today. You're hearing from me. I'm Ben Rapp. I'm principal at Securys, the consultancy that makes privacy practical for enterprise. You're going to hear from Romain Gauthier, who is the chief executive of Didomi, who are a French-based consent management platform. You're going to hear from John Llewellyn, who is the co-founder of Llewellyn Consulting, who are the economic consultants that we hired to do the Privacy Made Positive research for us, and from Lisa Hartman from Shopify, who has kindly agreed to give us Shopify's view on privacy. So I think, without further ado, let me turn to Lisa, and we'll hear from her about. In fact, let's start. Let's talk a little bit about Privacy Made Positive first, and then we'll turn to Lisa. I think just to give people time to join, have a few more people join us. We have a bit of an agenda at Securys. We are a privacy consulting business, but we were founded with the idea that privacy was a core component of how society functions and something that's very important to both basic human rights, but also successful commerce. And this Privacy Made Positive program is part of that agenda. We felt that there was an attitude that businesses complied with privacy because it was the law and that they were complying in a sense reluctantly. And we wanted to show that if you do privacy well, it actually benefits your organization. It attracts customers, it actually attracts staff as well. It drives loyalty, it drives propensity to purchase. We hired Llewellyn Consulting last year to do some economics research to look at the history of ethical behavior by companies. And you can go to our website and find the ebook from that research, which showed that ethical companies outperform. What we did next was to hire Kantar to do consumer research, and that's what this webinar is talking about. We went out to just over 4,000 consumers across Great Britain, Ireland, France, and Germany, and asked them how they respond to privacy, not just how they feel about it, but what they've done about it, how they act in response to privacy. And that research, as you'll see in this webinar, really demonstrates that privacy is something consumers value. It's something that drives their purchasing behavior, it drives their brand trust and their loyalty to brands. So on that note, and thinking about why privacy is a core component of how we interact commercially, let me turn to Lisa, who'll talk to you from Shopify's perspective about how they see privacy driving interaction with the merchants that they support. Lisa, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ben, and thank you for having me today. So as Ben said, my name is Lisa Hartman. I act as privacy counsel for Shopify, which is a commerce platform that services almost 2 million small, medium, and large businesses around the world. What we do is we help merchants with their marketing, website design, shipping logistics, point of sale, checkout, anything else that merchants need to run their businesses digitally and in traditional retail spaces. We also offer a consumer-facing app called Shop. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm looking at things from both the GDPR controller and processor point of view. So next slide. My goal in this talk will be to set the stage with some anecdotal examples to buttress Securys' qualitative study on the value of privacy, which is coming up right after this. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, what I do, and why I think this topic is so important. Next slide. So what I do at Shopify is I wear multiple hats, all of which require me to look at privacy from different angles. So first, I advise Shopify itself on its own legal obligations. Second, I'm embedded with the product development team. So I advise the team how to embed privacy by design principles and how to think of the downstream effects of privacy. And finally, I think about Shopify's ecosystem. So I want to help our merchants, our partners, our app developers do the right thing when it comes to privacy and make smart privacy decisions. As one of our engineers likes to say, we want to make it easy to do the right thing. Even though my title is Counsel, I rarely feel like I act as a lawyer. And this is because my job is so much more than just saying, this is what the law tells you to do, as Ben mentioned earlier. And this is for a few reasons. One is because laws change so fast and there are so many privacy laws coming in the books. So just for my own sanity, we use the GDPR as our North Star, which has really served us well as new laws come on the books, because we can use the GDPR as our foundation and then modify around the edges if we need to. So for example, we wrote a data protection addendum for the GDPR, as I'm sure many of you in the audience did as well. And then when the CCPA came into force, we only made some slight adjustments, like adding the definition of a service provider and sell, but kept the core of our GDPR substance. And we found that this mirrors what our merchants expect as well. As you can see by the next slide, there was a huge uptick in Google searches when the GDPR came into force. This is just a quick snapshot from Google Trends. So around mid-2018, there's this huge spike in people searching, what is the GDPR? But after that, you can see it levels off, and there was nothing like that for CCPA, the Brazilian law, the Canadian law. So we think people have a bit of alphabet soup fatigue. And our conclusion is that our merchants care about the substance of the privacy laws, but they don't have time to analyze every new law as it comes out. Next slide. And we feel the same from our consumer point of view too. We think that our consumers don't really care about the fine print and our legal analysis of the law. They only want us to meet their privacy expectations. So one example of this is when the GDPR came into force, we made a decision not to just honor the data subject rights of residents of the EU, but to extend the same rights to everyone around the world. And this was easy for us in a sense because we sidestepped the problem of figuring out who was a resident of the EU by determining address or IP address. But it also just made our consumers happy, and we think it was the right thing to do. And then later down the line, when other laws came into force, which also had data subject rights, we already had the infrastructure in place, so we didn't need to do anything new. And then finally, even as a lawyer doing this all day long, we often don't have clarity about what's coming down the pipe for new laws. And it's really difficult to go to your product teams or your consumers and say, well, I think that this new law says that we should do this, but we're not really sure. And the definition of personal information could change in 6 months or when new regulations come out. It's really hard to build trust that way. And it's hard to build products if you build to one specification and the law changes on you. So that's why we like to see privacy not just as a legal obligation, but as a value. And we build around the principles of doing the right thing. And we find that this makes us more nimble, more forward-looking, and it's not just reactive to a compliance obligation. So in sum, we think about privacy not just as a compliance burden or something you need to tick off on a checklist, but as a market differentiator, an ethical guidepost for your teams internally, and as a good investment to future-proof your business. And I think Ben and the team at Securys see it the same way, so I will turn the mic over to them.
Lisa, thank you very much. And I think it's clear that we and Shopify have a similar view on this, that privacy is ultimately a practical question about giving consumers what it turns out they want. And that's really where I want to go now. So we asked Kantar to do this research, kindly co-sponsored by Didomi, And then we turned back to Llewellyn Consulting and asked them to analyse the research so that we would have a properly independent view of what we were being told by the answers that we'd had from the respondents. So I'm going to turn you over to John Llewellyn to talk through what we found, and then Romain and I will pick up after each slide just to say what we think that means from a practical privacy delivery point of view. So John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ben, very much, and thank you for commissioning us to analyze these results, because they're extremely interesting, as it turned out. To begin, I think it's always encouraging when respondents indicate that they know what they're talking about, and in this case the respondents did. They said, yes, we do know what is meant by personal data, and a very high proportion said that. Actually, it strikes us, anything between 91% in Germany down to 85% in Great Britain. It's a high proportion of people saying, yes, we do know what the subject is about. There were no real differences across countries. This was pretty uniform. A personal guess here is I wouldn't be surprised if this figure is somewhat higher than it used to be. Certainly it's high now, and that's what we care about. It's fairly evenly distributed across age groups, across genders, across occupations, as well as I have said, about across countries. So that's the first point that we take from this, that people know what is meant by it. Do they care about it? That's the next question. Well, yes. If you look at the slide on the right, they certainly do. Again, the levels here are high. They're highest in Ireland, they're lowest in Germany, but they're always high. Perhaps they're lowest in Germany because they've got the greatest confidence in their legal system. Who knows? But they're high everywhere. And I think it's also worth making the point that only a tiny fraction don't feel confident about knowing what this is all about. 1 to 3%, quite minuscule. So two comments from that in summary. One, people do know what it's about, and two, they are concerned about it, apparently. If I go on to the next slide, in contrast to knowing what privacy is, which was pretty uniform, as I say, with respect to practically everything, concern about it does depend, to a degree at least, on age on the one hand and gender on the other. If you look at how concern about personal data is viewed in Germany, for example, and Ireland by age, you can see in both cases that concern rises with age. Possibly not surprising. The older you get, the more concerned you get about things like that. So again, it's interesting that the concern is as high as it is, even amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds, and rising quite strongly in both countries. So that makes, to our mind, eminent sense. If you look at how concern about the way personal data are used by gender, there are differences. They're not vast, but they're higher for women than for men. And of course, the significance of that is that women drive a disproportionately large proportion of all total expenditures in most economies, 70 to 80% of all consumer purchasing decisions, something like that. So that's the starting position. I think if you take all four in summary, people know what privacy is, they care about it, it's pretty uniform across countries at high levels. The concern isn't differentiated by country, but it does depend to some extent on age, and it does depend a bit on gender. So it's a very, if you like, a very solid start that this is given by the data. Ben, back to you.
Thank you, John. I think the takeaways from this for me, a lot of this part of the research wasn't a surprise, but I was interested to notice firstly that older consumers have this greater level of concern. And I think some of the country variations are worth remarking on. We know that German data protection authorities are by far the most active, and that seems to be reassuring German consumers that their interests are being looked after, which may be why they're overall level of concern is lower. But this point about women, I think, is very interesting. You know, it remains the case that consumer purchasing is driven by women, and it's clear that across the study, and in some countries by as much as 10% absolute, women are more concerned about what may happen to their data than men are. So I think, you know, we don't want to present privacy as a gendered topic, but I think if you're marketing to consumers, it's something of which you need to be aware. Romain, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you summarized it really well. I think overall people get privacy. They've heard about GDPR. They understand the risks, and they do get concerned with what you do with their personal data. For some of them, they've probably experienced some form of privacy experience that were disappointing or insufficient. So I think this is clearly shown by the figures. I also found it interesting to see that the older you get, the more concerned you get as well. For me, and maybe that could be an interesting point to search further, is it could be linked to technology literacy, so the ability to understand what technology is doing with your personal data and how, and I think it could also explain for some part why also younger people get less concerned. But it's very interesting. I think overall the figures are very clear, and to your point, and that's what we see as well with our clients, your ability to generate trust, so to generate consent from your audience, is linked to your revenue. For instance, if you get more people to accept what you do with their personal data, you'll be able to send more emails, you'll be able to generate more and more sales. So this relationship which is existing between privacy and your revenue as a company, I think is also kind of apparent in the second part of the survey, where I think focusing on your audience as a marketer will also mean to invest in privacy and how to correctly figure that out for your customers.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something we'll pick up on some more. I think one of the things that I found interesting was actually the level of concern even amongst young people. I mean, clearly one of the things about older people is that they have more money, they therefore have more to lose. So you can see why, when we go to the next slide, there may be some bias in what people's level of concern is. But to see that particularly in Ireland, you have 50% of very young people being concerned about what's happening with data is a sign that privacy is front of mind even amongst the young. John, let's go back to you and look a bit at what people were concerned about.
Yes, I think this was particularly interesting. There are 5 things that they're particularly worried about: identity theft, the use of data for other purposes than those for which they were ostensibly collected, the transfer of data outside the home country in which they were collected, the misuse of health data, and government surveillance. Now, the interesting thing about these 5 topics is that all 4 countries identified these same 5 concerns as their top concerns, and in the same order. So there's a fascinating overall uniformity. Those are the 5 things people care most about, regardless of which of the 4 countries, and they even put them in the same order. If you take identity theft first, over 70%, that's a high number for this sort of study. List identity theft as one of their top 5, as I say, and fully a third of them said that it was their top concern. And as we've seen with other aspects of this, concern increases with age. So identity theft, pigeonhole that one. That is top for every country, and it increases with age. That's a big takeaway. But that's not to decry the others. Around 60% list the use of data for purposes other than those for which the data were collected in their top 5. And about 15% say that's their top concern. And again, that concern increases with age. This transfer of data outside of the home country, the third one, nearly half listed that as a concern. There's some country differences here. Doubtless Ben will want to talk about it. In Germany, that was on a pretty equal footing with the next two. But again, the basic point, very nearly half of people are concerned about that. Then you come to the last two. Over a third of people are concerned about misuse of their health data, perhaps not surprising, and over a third are concerned about government surveillance. So these are a very coherent, consistent story. 5 things they're concerned about: identity theft, misuse of data for other purposes, transfer outside the country, health data being misused, and government surveillance. Same top 5 in all countries, even in the same order. So people do seem to be people when it comes to these 5 questions, Ben.
Thank you, John. And I mean, ultimately, I don't think any of us are surprised to see identity theft at the top of the list. We know that security has been the primary concern for people when working, dealing on the internet, when buying things online. People are worried about their payment card details being compromised, about their identity being compromised in other ways. What I found fascinating was that what we would see as privacy professionals as more technical concerns, things like extension of purpose and cross-border transfers, are now prevalent as concerns amongst ordinary consumers. These are things I think that people would not have recognized as issues 5 years ago. And I think that's driven by publicity from, the Schrems 2 case. It's driven by the scandals around Cambridge Analytica. We know what's driving it. But what was interesting was how consistent this was across all countries. Again, the Germans ranked cross-border transfers a bit lower, but again, they're the ones with the DPAs who've already been trying to prevent transfers, for example, to the US in a very activist way. So it doesn't surprise me. But seeing that extension of purpose ranked second was a real surprise. We gave people, I think, 15 choices. It was not, we weren't trying to bias the study, and they all put extension of purpose as, they're in their top 5 and as this kind of second rank. And I think that is extraordinary and is a real sign that people are worried about what's happening with their data beyond the risks to them of loans being taken out in their name or their bank account being compromised. And I think, Romain, turning to you, I think this is again very much part of this trust building and transparency exercise, where it's so important that companies tell people what they're going to do and make sure that the consumer is actually happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think consumers have a strong desire to really understand what is being done with their data, like how technology will be used with their personal data, and that's very simple. That's as an individual, everyone understands where it comes from, and like as you mentioned, a lot of things happened, especially with COVID-19. Lots of backlash around the COVID-19 applications, governmental applications, which were really doing too many things at the same time, and therefore were not that successful in many countries. So you could also feel signal of that coming from other places. But yeah, in general, I think what we can learn from that is that people want to understand. So as a company, there is a big opportunity to better inform your customers, to make sure they get to that understanding about what you will do with their data. Basically, like, there shouldn't be any surprise. That's as simple as that. So as a customer, I don't want surprises, and I don't want to be surprised in the future by what you've been doing with my data. As long as you explain me, I'm perfectly happy with leaving you optimize things, personalize my experience, offer me new products, new services. But I need to understand where it's coming from, and I need to probably accept it before it's being done.
Yeah, I think it's exactly this, isn't it? It goes back to the doctrine of reasonable expectations, right at the heart of, kind of Convention 108 and the foundations of privacy. This idea that you shouldn't find out later that somebody's doing something with your data that you weren't expecting. And I think that's what's happened to make people alarmed. I think it was interesting. I was expecting health data concerns to be higher than they were. So clearly, people.
I think overall, we overestimate the importance of sensitive data. I think, and sometimes it blurs our vision. So we concentrate privacy first on sensitive data. I think people are as much concerned about what will be done with their email, with their phone number, because it's bothering them on a daily basis. So my grandmother receives phone calls on a Saturday. She doesn't want that. That's going to impact her life positively if it stops. So I think we need to readapt, and from a marketing standpoint, I think it's a strong signal as well. It's not only about sensitive data, it's also about what you do with basic personal data from your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So John, let me turn back to you, and let's look at the core of our study. So this is where we started to, I think, move the game on from studies that have been done previously, because we were asking people, how does your concern about privacy affect your actual purchasing behavior? So John, do you want to talk to that?
Yes, Ben. I mean, when we were analyzing these numbers, we stopped at this point and thought, well, given what we've seen, given that they know what they're talking about, given that the concern, given that it's broadly speaking uniform across countries and so on, what would you expect from that? Because as analysts, you always like to have a prior before you look at the numbers. And we said, well, if these people are serious about what they say, if they mean it, then it ought to affect their decisions. So you then turn to this and say, well, do they affect their decisions, their purchasing decisions about buying a product or a service? And the answer turns out, yes, as you might have expected if they're telling you the truth about what concerns them, yes, they do. What you need to do here is look at the blue and the orange segments taken together, and nearly everyone pays attention to privacy of their personal data before they're purchasing a product or a service. Again, it's pretty uniform. Ben may point out some differences, but it's pretty uniform across age group. And again, rather striking, I have to say, only about a tiny proportion, 1 to 3%, pay no attention at all. And if you drill down from this a bit and you look at the bars on the right, for the impact of purchasing decisions on their commitments to consumer privacy, regardless of how you define this. In other words, it can be a decision to buy a product because of a firm's commitment to privacy, or it can be a decision not to go through with a purchase because you don't like a firm's commitment to privacy, or it could even be that you cancel a contract because you disapprove of their attitude to privacy. Take any one of those three ways of testing it, and you've got strikingly high proportions, lots of numbers up there around the 60% mark, of people who say, yes, we do actually carry this through into our actions. So I personally, we found when we analyzed these numbers, that's pretty striking, Ben.
Thank you, John. I mean, just before we move to the takeaways, this was the data that really surprised us. I mean, clearly we're privacy advocates and we think it's terribly important, but we were not expecting this level of evidence that people are engaging with privacy as part of their purchasing decision making. So not just the fact that 80% roughly on average of people routinely consider privacy before they engage with a brand, but also that so many people have preferred to buy a product because of a privacy commitment from the provider. I mean, clearly, and we'll say this again later on, it does look as if Apple are onto something. So Tim Cook and Apple in general have been very vocal about protecting consumer privacy and about that being a kind of core value for their brand. And their products are not cheap. You can buy a phone that does, by and large, the same things that an Apple phone does for rather less money. But it appears that Apple believe consumers will pay a premium. And we'll talk a bit more about people's willingness to pay a premium for privacy. But clearly people have chosen to buy product. And, north of 60% of people have chosen to buy product because of the supplier's commitment to privacy. Really interestingly, from my point of view, if you look at the other two blocks of bars on the right-hand side, the number of people who aborted a purchase, so effectively what I suspect Lisa would call a basket abandon, right? They've decided not to go through with buying something because at some point in the purchasing journey, you've gone too far from a privacy perspective. You've asked for too much information, you've wanted them to commit to too much later marketing, whatever it may be. And again, by and large, with Germany, again, as a kind of outlier, perhaps for the same reasons we've adduced before, you're seeing north of 60%, and in Ireland, 70% of people have said, oh, actually, I'm not going to do that because I don't like your privacy behavior. And we've all probably got anecdotal examples of this. Banks that want us to record a little video to prove that we're us, or organizations that want us to provide answers to security questions that dig quite deeply into our personal lives and also potentially expose our identity to risk when what we're protecting in that particular instance isn't that valuable to us. That's one of this kind of security mismatch question. And then finally, the number of customers who have walked away from an existing purchasing relationship. It's not just that doing privacy well attracts people, it's that doing it badly drives them away. They will stop buying from you. And, there's the WhatsApp Signal thing, right? 200 and something thousand people routinely download Signal. WhatsApp say they're going to share data with Facebook, and 9 million people download Signal. So we know that this happens, but clearly it happens much more routinely than perhaps we thought. And I think, if we look at the takeaways as a result from this, if you fail, something north of 70% of potential customers will not buy from you. But if you do well, then you've got a 60% greater propensity. 60% of customers are going to select you on the basis of doing privacy well. And from my perspective, this is new data. We've not seen this kind of thing in other studies. I think this is what we're really talking about here. There is a commercial advantage to doing privacy well. And Romain, I think this is right in your happy place, right?
Absolutely. I think that's one of our fights as a company. We think marketers are really blind around these issues. They don't measure that. They don't see that. They invest a great deal of resources to optimize the user experience, to better drive outcomes in terms of digital experience. But I think they are completely missing all these elements, which is, am I going too far? Am I asking for too much data? Am I making it complex for my customer to understand what will be done with their data, and so on and so forth? And so for me, there is a direct action to be taken for marketers to really work on that element, because it's kind of it's as if one of the key pillars of customer relationship was completely abandoned, and so the figures speak for themselves. It's critical to drive performance. So let's make sure it's properly addressed. What I think is, and you can push the logic a bit further, and that's what we see a number of advanced clients do. It's to invest in capturing these signals. So to invest in capturing preferences, in capturing better consents, and so in really giving full control to your customers. So really making sure that you're not missing any signal at all, because you ask directly the question, and make sure you capture that correctly, and make sure that your operations follow the signal that you've captured in terms of preference or frequency of communication, preference in terms of product, channels, consents for other purposes, and you just ask. I think it's a good strategy that can be directly inferred from these results.
Thank you, Romain. So let's move to what I think some people think is a slightly contentious finding, but I want to be really clear about what we think the message is here. So, John, do you want to talk us through this, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how we see it?
Yes, Ben. I mean, as an economist and as a firm of economists, for us, in many ways, this is the $64,000 question, to use the old-fashioned quiz show prize nomenclature. Because what we've seen so far is that people say they are concerned. They say they will take decisions on the basis of their concern. But there's always another stage, which is, are you willing to pay for it? Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? To what extent are you really serious when you say this? And to an economist, at least, it's when people say, I put a money value on this. It's one thing to walk away. It's another thing to put a money value on it. So I was most intrigued by this to find that in a lot of cases, people said, yes, I'm willing to pay for a better class of privacy. Now, I think the word better class, that's my own wording here, but the point is privacy is to some extent a right. Of course, you're entitled to it, but might you want more? And if you might want more, are you willing to pay for it? Do you value it? Will you actually reach into your wallet or your handbag for this? And what you've got here is in Britain, 35% of people say yes. Germany, 35% say yes. Similar number in France, even more in Ireland. So it's not just that we're not reporting, I think, or seeing reported here an attitude. We're actually saying here a statement of commitment. I will pay for something that I really want. It puts it in the class of most other consumer items, of course. I'm entitled to certain things, but I often would like to pay to get a better class of service. And that's what this is saying. Most instructive slide, in my view. Ben.
Thank you, John. Yes, I agree. And I think I want to be really clear about this. In those countries where there are privacy laws, there is a basic level of privacy that you are guaranteed as a right. It is also something in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights in Article 8 that you have a right to privacy and data protection. And we're not suggesting that anybody should say that it becomes a luxury good or that there is some kind of two-track thing. What we're really getting at here is you shouldn't be doing privacy as an organization just because you have to. You should be doing it because your consumers and employees value it, and this is evidence that they value it. It also means that you have choices as an organization. One of the issues with the internet, in our view, is that digital services have tended to be presented as being free. And of course, they're not. Nothing is free. The developers have to be paid, the hosting companies have to be paid, the servers have to be bought, the software has to be licensed. So the money has to come from somewhere. And by and large, where it's come from is advertising. And the way that that works is that you, the consumer, become the product. So your data is sold to the advertisers in order to pay for the developers and the servers and all the rest of it. And I think there has been an attitude in providers of digital services in particular that consumers are not prepared to pay for those services except with their data. And there's this old saw that if something is free, it's not the product, you are. And I think what this shows is that people are tired of that and that they would rather pay for the product with money than with their data. And there are some outlying early adopting companies that have already seen this coming. Apple is one of them. And they're perhaps the most visible, the highest profile. But we picked on Strava, partly because, as those of you who know me will know, I'm an obsessive cyclist, and therefore Strava is a bit of a feature of my life, but also because they took a view very early on as a data-driven, pure digital play service company, that they would not monetize user data. So they don't sell data, they don't sell targeted advertising. Instead, it's a freemium model. You can get a basic service for free, and then you can pay extra to get extra features, right? So you're not paying for extra privacy. They do the privacy for everybody, but you're expected to pay for the product. And they believe people will, and it seems to be working, and they make money. So, hey, and so this is firstly a reminder that you could charge for something that you're giving away in return for stopping selling people's data. It's also a sign that people will pay extra for things that go above and beyond the basic rights. There's no right in the GDPR for you to have your data end-to-end encrypted, right? There is a requirement that the appropriate organizational and technical measures are put in place. But if you wanted to go beyond that as an organization, say, we're going to try harder, we're going to really protect your data, this is exactly what Apple are doing, then we're saying consumers are willing to pay for that. They are interested in further protection, in going beyond the protections that are offered to them in law. And I think that's what this is about for me. There is consumer appetite for more privacy. And since that's going to cost you money to deliver, it is evident that there are people with an appetite to pay for that. So, having said that, let me move on to the actual takeaways and let somebody else talk. So that's my take. Romain, what do you make of this?
I'm with you. I think there are clearly alternatives to this model that you should give away your data to access any service or content out there. I think we are lacking of alternatives first and foremost as consumers, as internet users, and some of us would like to see these alternatives emerging. I think that's how I interpret this this slide. Obviously, there are a number of industries that have already gone through this transition. You mentioned the gaming industry. For me, is really interesting, where you have probably a fraction of users subsidizing the usage of the majority of users, but in return getting a better user experience, a more advanced gaming experience. And I think this kind of lesson could be applied to a number of services and products out there. And yeah, it's just a matter of really like figuring out what is your model. I also like the model of Patreon, so the idea that you give away good content, some services, and some of your highly loyal users are going to pay, and sometimes to pay a lot, to have you to maintain your access to your service and your content. And so I think we need alternatives, and like obviously, like people don't have the resource to pay for privacy in general, and so it's a right. They should be given like privacy, whatever their country. Actually, I'm a strong believer that it's a global right, and that's all these figures will be replicated around the globe, even in less like developed countries. I think as long as technology comes in, people at the end will ask for privacy. But yeah, fundamentally, I think it opens door for a lot of opportunities to figure out what kind of alternatives, what kind of additional services and features you can offer based on the idea that okay, privacy has a value for my customers.
Absolutely. And I mean, I just want to pick up on the last bullet point here. Our previous study really clearly demonstrated that over the long term, companies with a strong ethical stance do better financially. They make more money, they are worth more money. And I think this is a reminder that abusing people's personal data is not eventually going to lead to success. And what we're seeing here is consumers increasingly being alert to that. So I think, you know, this is about confirming that people actually place a value on ethical behavior. Anyway, we should move on. So, John, now just looking at the role of privacy in marketing, do you want to talk a little bit about what we found there?
Well, I think this last swatch of data, which are summarized in this chart, is reflexive, really. In other words, given all the things which the data have shown, you would expect people to say, yes, well, in that case, good privacy practice, practice where privacy information is concerned would lead me to trust more a company or a brand, whatever you want to call it. So in a way, this is a test of the coherence of the whole story. And that is what it turns out to be. If you look at those horizontal bars, again, these are pretty high numbers compared with a lot that we often analyze. I mean, in France, 72% say that good privacy information feeds into the image of a company and its brand. It rises to 78 in Germany, 79 in Great Britain, and fully 85% in Ireland. So this is strong. People say, given everything we've heard them say, they do go the logical extra mile and say this feeds into my assessment, my perception of the company as a name and as a brand. Again, fairly evenly distributed across age groups. A takeaway which was interesting in this is that about half of consumers, it varies of course a bit, but as a takeaway, about half of consumers routinely refuse cookies and emails. That's the baseline number to take away. But the number increases if they are dealing with a company which had good privacy policy from the outset. In other words, if I know from the outset that this is a company with a good privacy policy, apparently I'm statistically much more likely to accept their cookies. And that's what you've got on the right, that the likelihood rises from around the half, the 50% figure that I quoted, to 66% in Germany, 71% in France and Great Britain, and 77% in Ireland. So it really does seem ultimately that the story told in this set of data, at least from our analytic point of view, is coherent. And it's now, as I say, gone reflexive in this last slide and says this does feed into people's perceptions of brand, all the more so if the company I'm dealing with, I knew had good practices from the outset.
Thank you, John. Before we move to the takeaways from this, just a reminder to people to put your questions in the question pane so that we can address them in the Q&A, which is coming up after the summary of this slide and an overall summary of the presentation. And I think for me that the takeaway here is again not at all surprising given what we saw in the rest of the data. The critical point here is consumers are seeing privacy as a significant contributor to their overall trust in a brand. And that then contributes to their willingness to engage with the brand. So essentially what we're saying here is if you do privacy well, it drives brand engagement. And what that says to me is that privacy is part of your marketing function as well as your compliance function. That you need to see privacy as an active choice that you're using as part of your brand positioning. It's not just a box ticking exercise that you do in compliance to avoid being fined. And I think, you know, Romain, do you want to talk a bit more to this? So this is clearly very much at the heart of your offering.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I think 50% of users opt out, but what is really interesting is they don't opt out all the time, and that's where, as a marketer, there is clearly opportunities to differentiate, to really figure out for your company what it means to ask the user for consent, to ask them for their preferences, and how to drive that number up. Because if you're transparent, if you explain correctly, if you inform correctly, if you provide a honest choice without too much nudging, then it pays out, and so that's what we see in our figures. So actually, understanding your consent rates, understanding user behaviors in front of the consent question you ask is new. So a lot of marketers don't have this information. They don't know how much people consent or don't consent. And therefore, what is the impact on their operations and business metrics? So that's the first thing to start with as a marketer, understanding this key moment where people will vote or not for your confidence, and I think that's something new and really interesting from a marketer standpoint. It's a matter of user experience, of really clarity of your brand in general. So it's clearly a new way to look at this question, and yeah, it has an impact, a significant impact, if you do it right, because it's rewarding. People will accept more, will end up opting in more, and so the more transparent you are, the more control you give away, I think the better off you'll be in the end as a marketer. Obviously, it's a journey, so not all countries, all companies, all verticals are at the same level of maturity with respect to these questions. The relationship between consent and their revenue is not direct necessarily, and so I think it will take time, but overall, and I think the survey confirms that it's a bet that is worth taking as a marketer, because you will end up in a better position, and there are lots of opportunities there to reinvent part of your customer relationship, which was completely neglected, and where you can really apply the same type of focus as you applied on other marketing elements. And yeah, it's a matter of user experience and customer relationship. So what is the level of quality you want to put into your user experience and your customer relationship, and from there you can decide what how to treat this question.
Thank you. I mean, I think I agree with you, and I think this is, for me, this is closing the circle. If you remember the very first slide, which talked about privacy as being part of trust building, I think this is the ultimate support of that says, you know, people will engage with you in all sorts of ways if they trust you better. So we've said that they're more likely to buy from you. We've said that they may be prepared to pay more. But clearly, before they'll do either of those things, they first of all have to learn about you and about the products that you're offering. And they're only going to be interested in doing that if they think you can be trusted with the data about them that you already have and with the behavior that you're going to exhibit if they have a commercial relationship with you. And for me, what this says is this point that privacy has to be interwoven into everything you do rather than being seen as an add-on. It has to be part of your marketing activity. It also has to be part of your product development. Again, don't think of privacy by design and by default as some kind of tedious, bureaucratic, oh God, I've got to comply with Article 25, tick, tick, tick thing. Think about it as weaving it into the value proposition of your product. People are prepared to pay for privacy. If you build privacy into your product is more valuable. Don't see it as a cost, see it as a benefit. I think that's really what we're saying here. I'm about to move on to the Q&A. What I wanted to say to introduce that is this is not all of the research. This is a summary of some of the research. There is an ebook that is going to be sent out to attendees after this event, and which you're welcome to share, which contains much more detail on what we found across the whole cohort study that we did. We're also continuing with this project. So the next thing we're going to do is to look at employees and how they interact with employer privacy. And again, our previous research suggested that employees are also sensitive to how their data is treated. Again, this is about trust, and it's about both attracting employees and motivating them, and of course about retaining them. You attract them, you motivate them, you want to keep them. So you need to think about privacy across your whole organization, not just in your outbound consumer marketing, but also as part of how you attract employees and keep them engaged. So turning to questions, we've got some really good ones. The first question is coming from Sacha Brooks, and he's saying, how do we reconcile our research results with the market share of Amazon, which does not exactly put privacy at the front? Are consumers willing to pay for privacy in cash, but not willing to pay for privacy and convenience? Or will Amazon's business model have to change one day? Well, Lisa, I think this feels like a question for you as somebody who, fundamentally provides the infrastructure with which people compete with Amazon.
Oh, you put me on the spot, Ben. I was not going to comment on Amazon's business model.
I'm not expecting anyone to comment on Amazon's behavior, but let's talk about privacy in the context of online shopping in a more general way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I can speak to Shopify's business model only. And as Ben said, we offer a subscription service, so merchants pay to use our platform. We do not share information among merchants. We do not target advertisements to our merchants or sell our merchants' data. And I think if you look at our numbers, you can see that we're growing quickly, and merchants support this model, and more merchants are interested in this. And we don't plan on making any changes anytime soon. And I think that's all I can say about our business position versus Amazon's.
John, or Preston, just to introduce Preston. Preston works with John at Llewellyn Consulting, and Preston actually did quite a lot of the work on analysing the data. Did you have an economist's view on Amazon's market dominance and how that might be affected by privacy over the longer term?
Gosh. Well, one thing about Amazon is it has become so convenient to buy. You can buy with literally one click, and certainly from my personal perspective, that tends to trump a lot of everything else. Ease of purchase. That's my perspective. John, what did you have another?
No, you take the words from my mouth. Really, I was going to put it differently, but it's the same point. That yes, privacy is important, and it's something that people will pay for, and it's something which enhances your brand. It's not the sole determinant of market position, of course. And what got Amazon to where it did was that it also has two other key features. One is it's easy to buy, and the second is it's easy to pay. But Amazon, that doesn't mean Amazon couldn't be in a better position if it were even more trusted where its data concerned. Personally, I think it's going to have to. Yeah, so that's my answer.
I think Amazon is doing really well in terms of security first. So when you trust Amazon with your data, you feel it's secure, and I think it explains part of their success. So in that sense, they are meeting the needs of their consumers. I would also argue that when you give away your data to Amazon, you also know that they will do a great job at personalizing your experience and at making sure that you get access to the right products. And so in that sense, they also are really legitimate to use your personal data to offer more service and a better and more personalized experience. Where I don't follow Amazon is with their advertising business, which is more recent. So and they've not invested that much in that business. If you look at Google or even an Apple, it's a different trajectory. And that's where maybe it will kind of fail. So if they start using your personal data for their own interest to sell ads to advertisers, that's where I think where their model could be questioned by consumers more and more. Not to say that all consumers are going to put that ahead of other convenience that we just described. But still, I think they are pretty focused in their usage of personal data, in the care they put into the security and your overall user experience. So I think they are trusted, and from that perspective, they do a good job.
I think, I want to move on to the next question, but I mean, very quickly, I'd agree with you that I think Amazon is trusted from a security perspective. I suspect part of the issue is that people may not be aware of what's happening with their data in the Amazon ecosystem. Amazon has not been the subject of the same kind of exposés as, say, Facebook, and that may come. I think that's something that Amazon should be alert to. Moving on, Rob Atherton asked about the scale of the study. This is all covered in the ebook, but very broadly, we looked at about 4,250 consumers across 4 countries, a little bit more than 1,000 consumers in each of GB, Ireland, Germany, and France. Kantar did the research. They balanced the panels to make sure they were demographically representative. And so we think this is, genuinely statistically significant and meaningful for the countries that we've surveyed, which leads on to Elizabeth Coker's question, which is, I know you don't have data to support this, but based on your market knowledge, do you believe this data is only applicable in Europe, or do you think it would be similar or different if conducted in the US, Canada, or Australia? Well, I think turning first of all to Canada, Lisa, do you want to talk about what Shopify's experience is from your perspective? You've got the most global perspective, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thank you for that. If you couldn't tell from my accent, I'm Canadian, located in North America. So I say privacy is privacy. Yeah, so I think it's a fundamental difference, the way that North America looks at privacy versus Europe. In North America, the view is much more privacy and your data is transactional, it's a commercial good. Privacy isn't enshrined in a fundamental Charter of Rights, constitutional a little bit, but it's just seen as more of a commercial transaction. And we see more skepticism as well. So I was actually surprised that your number was only 50% of people decline cookies. We see much higher rates. It's maybe only 10% opt in to receiving cookies. So those are just a few differences. But yeah, just our laws have sort of a different view of what privacy is, what should be protected, and how that should be balanced with commercial interests.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's worth saying that the picture certainly in the US, the picture is evolving. California leading the way. They've passed 2 privacy regulations in the last 2 years with CCPA and then CPRA. We've now got, it depends whether you count Maine, 3 or 4 states have got privacy regulations that have some meaning to them. And there are 2 different federal privacy laws currently in front of Congress. So things are moving forward there. And I think that's driven again by awareness. As Lisa said, it's more transactional, but of course, knowing that your data has value is also a sign that privacy has value, that you put a monetary number on it. I think the concerns would be different, but I don't think the concerns would be absent. Romain, do you want to put anything in there very quickly, because we've got a number of other questions to move to?
I've got one thing I can add. Sorry, just one thing. Just that IBM actually in 2015 did a study on attitudes to privacy globally, and they do differ fairly significantly, or at least they did differ fairly significantly in 2015. The most concerned happened to be Germany, and the least concerned happened to be India. But there are cultural differences, and we think they relate also to economic development as well.
Yes, and of course, India's got the 2nd highest incidence of data breaches in the world at the moment, and it's growing at about 15% a year. So I think they'll start to take it pretty seriously when they feel the consequences of that.
Yeah, I would lean into the same direction. I think maturity towards privacy questions is very much depending on the kind of scandals you've been subjected to or informed about. And so I see an accelerated trend towards privacy all over the world, because technology is global, and so scandals are global, and people get concerned even if their regulatory frameworks are lagging behind. They do care, and even in the US, I think, as Lisa put it, it's going to be more transactional, so more embedded into like customer relationship rather than the law. But the effect will be similar from an organization and brand perspective.
Thank you, Romain. We are running out of time. We have a lot more questions that we won't have time to answer, but what I will do is circulate those by email around the panel, and then we will go back to everybody with the answers in an email later on. So it remains for me to thank our panel very much for taking the time today, and to remind everybody that the ebook will be sent out to them and also available for download from our website. If you go to privacymadepositive.com, you can learn more about the program, and you can also request the ebook from the previous research that we did last year. The last thing I want to do is just hand over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk about the next event that we're running on the 25th of May. Sarah.
Thank you, and thanks for that, everyone. That was really interesting. Luckily, you don't have to wait a long time for the next interesting discussion. I'd like to invite you to celebrate the 3rd birthday of the GDPR on the 25th of May at 11 AM. Fantastic panel, including Leah Hurst, who's Head of Legal and Business Affairs at the Royal Opera House, Sophie Ebers, Data Protection Principal at Anglo-American and De Beers, Lauren Sherlock, a consultant with us here at Securys. Cindy will be posting a link and we'll send you a follow-up invite, so please register and join us if you can. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.